Long before the Great Pyramids rose above the desert, before pharaohs ruled from stone temples and dynastic timelines were etched in hieroglyphs, the land we now call Egypt was already witnessing a quiet but profound transformation. This story begins not with kings, but with climate, rivers, and the first communities that learned how to live along one of the most remarkable waterways on Earth, the Nile. Around 15,000 years ago, during the late Paleolithic period, northern Africa looked very different from today. Much of what is now the Sahara Desert was then a savanna-like environment, rich with wildlife and vegetation. Early human populations, made up of hunter-gatherers, moved across the landscape in search of game, edible plants, and fresh water. These people left behind rock art in desert caves, depicting giraffes, elephants, and even boats, evidence of a once green Sahara. But between 8000 and 6000 BCE, a major climate shift occurred. Gradually, rainfall diminished. The Sahara began to dry up, transforming from grassland to arid desert. As water sources disappeared, people who had once roamed widely were now drawn to the only reliable watercourse in the region, the Nile River. It was here, along its banks, that the earliest seeds of Egyptian civilization were planted. The Nile flows from the south to the north, fed by tributaries in what are today Ethiopia and the Great Lakes region of Central Africa. Each year, the river flooded its banks, depositing rich silt that made farming possible. This natural cycle created a narrow but fertile strip of land through an otherwise harsh and barren landscape. The river was not just a source of food, it became a highway for trade, communication, and eventually, political power. The first clear evidence of organized communities in Egypt appears in the region around 5000 BCE. These early societies began practicing agriculture, domesticating animals, and making pottery. Archaeologists call these early farming cultures the Fayum-A, Badarian, and Naqada cultures, named after the regions where their remains were first discovered. The Badarian culture, centered in Upper Egypt, dates to roughly 4400 BCE. It represents one of the earliest known farming communities in the Nile Valley. These people cultivated wheat and barley, raised cattle and sheep, and lived in small villages. Their pottery, thin-walled, highly polished, and decorated with geometric designs, shows a high level of craftsmanship. They also buried their dead in simple graves with goods, suggesting belief in an afterlife. By around 3800 BCE, the Naqada culture had emerged, marking a significant step toward more complex social organization. Naqada settlements grew in size and importance, particularly along trade routes connecting the Nile to the Red Sea and to Nubia in the south. Trade brought not only goods, such as gold, ivory, and incense, but also ideas and technologies. Naqada pottery became more varied, featuring images of animals, boats, and human figures. More importantly, elites began to distinguish themselves through elaborate graves containing luxury items. This is where we begin to see signs of emerging hierarchy, an important step toward state formation. The process of unification and political centralization began in earnest during the Naqada II period, roughly between 3500 and 3200 BCE. During this time, various regional leaders, or chieftains, likely competed for control of trade routes and agricultural land. One of the most powerful centers was the town of Hierakonpolis, known to the Egyptians as Nekhen. Here, archaeologists have discovered large ceremonial structures, industrial-scale breweries, and graves of elite individuals that predate the pyramids by centuries. Among the most significant finds from this period is the so-called scorpion mace head, discovered at Hierakonpolis. It shows a ruler, possibly named Scorpion, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and engaging in ritual acts. This is not yet pharaonic Egypt, but the imagery suggests that rulers were beginning to associate themselves with divine authority and national symbolism. The ultimate outcome of these developments was the emergence of two distinct regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, centered in the Nile Delta. These regions developed separate cultural traditions and leadership, but they also grew increasingly connected through trade and conflict. Eventually, a leader from Upper Egypt, often identified as Narmer, would succeed in unifying the two lands into a single kingdom. That moment marks the beginning of dynastic Egypt. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Egypt was a land of two regions. Upper Egypt in the south, with its narrow strip of fertile land bordered by cliffs and desert, and Lower Egypt in the north, dominated by the vast fan of the Nile Delta. Though connected by the Nile, these two regions had developed distinct identities, traditions, and centers of power. But this division would not last forever. A new chapter was about to begin, one that would give birth to a unified Egyptian state, and with it, the institution of kingship that would dominate the country's history for over 3,000 years. At the heart of this transformation was a powerful leader from the south. His name was Narmer. Although some scholars debate whether Narmer and Menes were the same individual or two successive rulers, the balance of archaeological and historical evidence points to Narmer as the figure most directly associated with the unification of Egypt. The most famous artifact linked to Narmer is the Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone object discovered at Hierakonpolis, one of Upper Egypt's most important early cities. Dating to around 3100 BCE, the palette shows Narmer wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. On both sides, he is depicted as a conqueror and ruler, surveying rows of defeated enemies, presiding over rituals, and symbolically joining the two lands. The imagery is rich in symbolism. Narmer is shown larger than other figures, emphasizing his status and authority. He holds a mace, a symbol of power, over a kneeling enemy. Above, the falcon god Horus, associated with divine kingship, hovers over papyrus plants, a symbol of Lower Egypt. The message is clear. The ruler of Upper Egypt had subdued the Delta and now claimed to rule both lands. This moment was more than a military victory. It was a political and ideological turning point. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt created a new national identity, one expressed through symbols such as the double crown, called the pshent, which combined the crowns of the two regions, and the title King of the Two Lands, which every pharaoh would carry from that point forward. With unification came the formation of the First Dynasty. Narmer's successors established a capital city at Memphis, strategically located near the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, the pharaohs could oversee both regions, control trade routes, and manage the growing complexities of the state. Memphis would remain a central seat of power for centuries. The new kingdom was not just a collection of towns under a single ruler. It was an organized state with institutions designed to consolidate control. Bureaucracy began to take shape. Taxation systems were introduced to support the central authority. Skilled administrators and scribes, trained in the newly developed writing system of hieroglyphs, played a crucial role in managing records, resources, and decrees. The early kings of the First Dynasty, including Horaha, Jer, and Den, expanded on Narmer's legacy. They undertook military campaigns into Nubia and the Sinai Peninsula, seeking to secure trade routes and raw materials such as copper, gold, and stone. These early efforts at expansion reveal that even at this early stage, Egypt's rulers were already thinking beyond the Nile Valley. The First Dynasty also left behind some of Egypt's earliest monumental tombs. In the desert at Abydos, royal tombs were constructed using mud brick and wood, often accompanied by subsidiary graves of attendants and offerings. These tombs marked the beginning of the long-standing tradition of associating royal burials with divine power and the journey to the afterlife. Religion played an increasingly central role in unifying Egypt. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, but was also seen as a divine figure, a living god on earth. This belief served to legitimize his rule and connect the institution of kingship with cosmic order, or Ma'at, a concept central to Egyptian thought. Maintaining Ma'at meant ensuring justice, balance, and prosperity across the land. The role of the gods was reflected in the development of temple architecture and religious ceremonies. The falcon god Horus became closely tied to the pharaoh's identity, while other deities such as Hathor, Nith, and Seth were honored in different regions. Over time, state-sponsored religion would become a powerful force, shaping art, governance, and daily life. With the foundations of centralized rule laid by the early dynasties, Egypt entered what historians call the Old Kingdom, a period that spanned roughly from 2686 BCE to 2181 BCE. This era is often referred to as the Age of the Pyramids, and for good reason. During these centuries, the Egyptian state reached new heights of administrative control, architectural ambition, and cultural unity. The structures built during this period, especially the pyramids at Giza, remain among the most recognizable monuments in the world today. But beyond the stone and sand, this was also a time of profound development in the organization of the Egyptian state and the articulation of royal power. The Old Kingdom began with the Third Dynasty, and one of its most prominent rulers was Djoser. His reign marks a crucial turning point in Egyptian architecture and ideology. Djoser commissioned the construction of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, a project overseen by his vizier and architect Imhotep. This was the first large-scale stone building in history. Prior to this, royal tombs were primarily constructed from mud brick. The Step Pyramid was a radical departure, not just in material, but in concept. It was not merely a tomb, but a complex designed to reflect the divine status of the king and his eternal connection to the gods. Imhotep, a name preserved in inscriptions and later deified in Egyptian culture, was not only an architect, but also a high priest and physician. His innovation laid the groundwork for all future pyramid construction and for the symbolic language of royal power expressed through stone. The Fourth Dynasty witnessed the peak of pyramid construction. Sneferu, the dynasty's founder, experimented with pyramid design by constructing multiple structures, including the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. These projects reflect both architectural experimentation and an evolving understanding of how to express royal authority through scale and permanence. It was Sneferu's successor Khufu, also known by his Greek name Cheops, who commissioned the Great Pyramid at Giza. Built around 2560 BCE, the Great Pyramid originally stood at over 480 feet tall and remained the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 4,000 years. The scale of the project is staggering. Millions of limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, were quarried, transported, and assembled with remarkable precision. The construction of the pyramid required not only architectural knowledge, but also a vast labor force. Contrary to popular myths, the builders were not enslaved populations, but rather well-fed laborers, many of whom were likely conscripted from across Egypt on a rotating basis. They lived in nearby workers' villages and were supported by an elaborate system of food supply, water management, and medical care. These workers left behind graffiti in hidden chambers of the pyramids, offering a glimpse into their lives and a human voice in the shadow of monumental stone. Khufu's successors, Khafre and Menkaure, continued the tradition by building their own pyramids at Giza. Khafre's complex also included the Great Sphinx, a colossal limestone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a king, likely Khafre himself. The Sphinx stands as a guardian of the necropolis and a symbol of royal might fused with cosmic order. These massive projects were more than displays of wealth. They were political statements and religious instruments. The pyramid was a place of resurrection where the king would ascend to the heavens and join the gods, especially Ra, the sun god. The alignment of the pyramids with celestial bodies, particularly the stars and the path of the sun, reflects the spiritual and astronomical knowledge of the time. The pyramid complexes also featured mortuary temples, causeways, and satellite structures, all carefully planned to serve the king's eternal journey. These complexes became centers of ritual activity and economic production, maintained by endowments and staffed by priests. As pyramid building flourished, so too did the machinery of the state. The Old Kingdom saw the refinement of Egypt's administrative system. The pharaoh appointed viziers, governors, and scribes who managed everything from grain storage and tax collection to construction projects and provincial affairs. Hieroglyphic writing became more sophisticated, and a body of scribal literature began to emerge, laying the intellectual foundation of Egyptian civilization. However, the centralization of power also meant that much depended on the strength and authority of the pharaoh. As the 5th and 6th dynasties progressed, signs of strain began to emerge. The cost of maintaining the vast pyramid complexes and priesthoods weighed heavily on the treasury. More importantly, local officials, known as nomarchs, began to grow in power, especially in the provinces far from Memphis. These officials often passed their titles hereditarily, creating semi-independent centers of influence. Religious changes also marked the later Old Kingdom. The cult of Ra gained prominence, with the pharaoh increasingly seen as the son of Ra. Several kings of the 5th dynasty built sun temples in addition to their pyramids. Meanwhile, texts inscribed inside the pyramids of rulers like Unas, the so-called pyramid texts, began to articulate complex visions of the afterlife and the divine nature of the king. The magnificent pyramids of the Old Kingdom still stood proudly in the desert, silent witnesses to an age of divine kings and centralized power. But behind those stone monuments, a slow unraveling had already begun. As the 6th dynasty waned, so did the power of the royal court. By the close of the 3rd millennium BCE, Egypt entered a time of fragmentation and instability, an era historians call the First Intermediate Period, lasting from around 2181 BCE to roughly 2055 BCE. This was not a sudden collapse marked by a single dramatic event. Rather, it was a gradual breakdown of the centralized authority that had held the Egyptian state together for centuries. Multiple factors contributed to this decline, including weak leadership, economic strain, environmental stress, and the growing independence of local governors. The long reign of Pepi II, which extended for more than 90 years, left Egypt without strong leadership at the time of his death. His successors were either too young, too short-lived, or too weak to hold the kingdom together. Meanwhile, the regional governors, known as nomarchs, who had once served at the pleasure of the pharaoh, began to act independently. Over time, their positions became hereditary, and their allegiance to the central government faded. Compounding these political problems was a series of low Nile floods. The annual inundation of the Nile was the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture. When the floods failed or were too weak, harvests diminished. Food shortages became more frequent, trade slowed, and local economies suffered. In the absence of a strong central authority, communities turned inward, relying on local leaders for survival. This period saw a decentralization of power, not only in politics, but also in culture. For the first time, tomb inscriptions and burial styles began to vary widely between regions. Local elites carved their own autobiographies into their tomb walls, emphasizing their role in providing for their communities during hard times. These inscriptions provide valuable insights into how ordinary people viewed leadership and justice during this era. Two major centers of power emerged during this time. In the north, the city of Heracleopolis became the seat of rulers who claimed to be the legitimate successors of the Old Kingdom pharaohs. These kings, often referred to as the 9th and 10th dynasties, controlled much of Lower Egypt and parts of Middle Egypt. They maintained certain royal traditions, including the use of pyramid texts and ceremonial regalia, but their actual authority was limited. In the south, the city of Thebes rose to prominence under a separate line of rulers. These kings, associated with the 11th dynasty, began as local governors but gradually asserted their independence. The most important of these early Theban rulers was Intef I, who styled himself as Overlord of Upper Egypt. He and his successors, Intef II and Intef III, engaged in a series of military campaigns to expand their influence northward. The conflict between Heracleopolis and Thebes eventually escalated into open warfare. Each side sought to control the strategic region around Abydos and the central Nile Valley. Skirmishes and battles were fought for years, turning Central Egypt into a contested zone. These clashes were not just about territory, they were also ideological. Both factions claimed to uphold Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and justice, and both sought to portray the other as illegitimate. Amid this political fragmentation, Egyptian society did not collapse entirely. In fact, this period witnessed an increase in local creativity and experimentation. Art, literature, and architecture became more diverse. Local officials commissioned modest but personalized tombs. The autobiography inscriptions, written by non-royal individuals, began to emphasize personal morality, civic duty, and justice, values that would later shape Egyptian ethical thought. One of the most remarkable literary works from this period is The Instruction for Merikare, a didactic text written in the form of advice from a Heracleopolitan king to his son. Though semi-fictional, it reflects the real concerns of rulers during a time of uncertainty. The text advises moderation, care for subjects, and respect for local gods, a far cry from the divine absolutism of Old Kingdom pharaohs. Meanwhile, the Theban rulers continued their rise. The decisive moment came under the leadership of Mentuhotep II, a powerful and ambitious king who ruled in the early 21st century BCE. He launched a final campaign against the north, defeating the last Heracleopolitan king and reunifying Egypt under his rule. Mentuhotep II declared himself king of Upper and Lower Egypt, reviving the title once held by the likes of Narmer. His victory marked the end of the First Intermediate Period and the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. But unlike earlier pharaohs, Mentuhotep II knew the dangers of unchecked regional autonomy. He implemented reforms to reassert central authority, including the restructuring of provincial administration and increased oversight of local officials. When Mentuhotep II reunified Egypt after generations of division and civil conflict, he did more than restore the throne. He initiated a new chapter in Egyptian history. The period that followed, known as the Middle Kingdom, lasted from approximately 2055 BCE to around 1650 BCE. It marked a time of political consolidation, administrative reform, artistic renewal, and cultural flourishing. Though less famous than the Pyramid Age that came before or the imperial grandeur that came after, the Middle Kingdom is widely regarded by Egyptologists as one of the finest eras in ancient Egyptian civilization. Mentuhotep II, the ruler who had brought unity through military strength, ruled from Thebes and established himself as both a political and religious leader. His reign laid the foundation for a strong centralized government. While maintaining royal authority, he remained cautious of the decentralization that had led to the breakdown of the Old Kingdom. To that end, he began reorganizing provincial governance, reducing the influence of hereditary nomarchs and appointing loyal officials instead. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, located near Thebes, stood as a symbol of both his power and his piety. Constructed into a natural cliffside, it reflected a fusion of architectural innovation and religious devotion. This structure would later inspire the famous Temple of Hatshepsut centuries later. In the time of Mentuhotep II, it served as a visual representation of national renewal. Following Mentuhotep's reign, the 11th dynasty continued for a time, but it was the 12th dynasty that truly elevated the Middle Kingdom to a golden age. Founded by Amenemhat I, this dynasty moved the royal capital northward to a newly built city called Ich-Tawi, near the entrance to the Fayum region. The move was strategic. It allowed better control over the delta and trade routes, while also symbolizing a fresh beginning. Amenemhat I implemented a series of reforms to further strengthen central authority. He reorganized the administration by placing trusted officials in key posts, many of whom were not drawn from old elite families but were promoted through merit. This practice helped curb the influence of provincial powers and built a more efficient bureaucratic system. The Middle Kingdom is notable for the rise of a professional class of scribes, administrators, and overseers whose records, preserved in tombs and papyri, offer rich detail about everyday governance. One key reform introduced during this time was the creation of a co-regency system. Under this practice, a reigning pharaoh would appoint his successor as co-ruler while still alive. This helped ensure smooth transitions of power and avoided the succession crises that had weakened earlier dynasties. Amenemhat I himself ruled alongside his son, Senusret I, establishing a precedent that would be followed for several generations. Senusret I, and later his successors, Senusret II and Senusret III, carried out campaigns of expansion and fortification. They pushed Egypt's borders southward into Nubia, a region rich in gold, cattle, and other resources. To secure these gains, massive fortresses were built along the Nile in the Second Cataract region. These were not only military installations but also administrative centers, enabling the integration of Nubia into the Egyptian sphere. Senusret III, in particular, became a model of royal authority. His statues depict a stern and somber face, with heavy-lidded eyes and a sense of seriousness that contrasted with the idealized images of earlier kings. This style of portraiture reflected a shift in how kingship was portrayed, not merely divine, but also burdened with the responsibility of rule. Internally, the Middle Kingdom saw significant investment in irrigation, agriculture, and mining. The Fayum region was partially reclaimed and developed, enhancing food production. Expeditions to the Sinai Peninsula, the Red Sea coast, and the Eastern Desert brought in valuable resources like copper, turquoise, and stone. This period was also marked by a cultural renaissance. Literature, in particular, flourished. Works like The Tale of Sinuhe, The Eloquent Peasant, and The Instruction of Amenemhat became cornerstones of Egyptian literary tradition. These texts reflected new themes: moral reflection, personal responsibility, and political realism. The Tale of Sinuhe, for instance, told the story of a royal official who fled Egypt under mysterious circumstances, lived among foreigners, and eventually returned home to be buried with honor. Though fictional, it expressed values of loyalty, identity, and the centrality of Egypt as a homeland. Art and architecture also experienced a revival. While pyramid construction continued, the focus shifted toward more modest but better planned structures. Many Middle Kingdom pyramids were built of mud brick and encased in limestone, a practical approach that differed from the grandiose ambitions of the Old Kingdom. Tomb decoration grew more elaborate and realistic, featuring scenes of daily life, agriculture, industry, and family, offering an invaluable window into the lives of Egyptians beyond the royal court. One of the lesser-known yet highly influential figures of this period was Sobekneferu, the last ruler of the 12th dynasty and the first confirmed female pharaoh of Egypt. Though her reign was relatively brief, she maintained order and completed construction projects started by her predecessors. Her existence demonstrated that the office of kingship, while traditionally male, could be held by a capable woman when circumstances demanded. As the Middle Kingdom progressed into the 13th dynasty, signs of strain began to emerge. While the 13th dynasty initially continued the traditions of its predecessors, it gradually weakened due to rapid turnover of kings, less effective administration, and growing instability in the Delta region. At the same time, groups of migrants from Western Asia, often referred to as Asiatics, began settling in the Eastern Delta. These newcomers brought with them new technologies, ideas, and cultural influences that would soon play a pivotal role in Egyptian history. The end of the Middle Kingdom brought with it the fading of one of Egypt's most admired dynasties. As centralized power declined, a new and more complex chapter began. From around 1650 BCE to approximately 1550 BCE, Egypt entered a period of fragmentation and foreign rule known as the Second Intermediate Period. It was a time of political disunity, cultural shifts, and technological change, a turbulent era that would eventually give birth to Egypt's rise as an empire. At the heart of this transformation was the emergence of a foreign group known to the Egyptians as the Hatshepsut, a phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands. Later historians would translate this into the Greek word Hyksos. These newcomers were not initially invaders in the traditional sense. They began as immigrants, traders, and workers who settled in the eastern Nile Delta during the later part of the Middle Kingdom. Many likely came from Canaan and other parts of Western Asia. Over time, as central authority weakened and the 13th dynasty declined, these foreign communities grew in influence. Eventually, a group of Hyksos leaders seized control of the city of Avaris in the northeastern delta and established their own ruling dynasty, the 15th dynasty. From Avaris, the Hyksos governed large parts of Lower Egypt using both force and diplomacy. The Hyksos introduced several important innovations to Egypt. Most notably, they brought new forms of military technology, including the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and improved metal weaponry. These tools gave them a decisive advantage over the slower and more traditional armies of the native Egyptian rulers. The use of the horse and chariot, in particular, would later be adopted by the Egyptians and used to great effect in future military campaigns. The Hyksos also brought cultural influences from the Near East. Their pottery, art, and religious practices reflected a blend of Levantine and Egyptian traditions. They worshipped both local Egyptian deities and their own gods, such as Baal and Anat. In many ways, they assimilated into Egyptian life, adopting royal titles, building temples in traditional styles, and using hieroglyphic inscriptions to legitimize their rule. Despite their attempts at legitimacy, the Hyksos were still viewed by many Egyptians as foreign occupiers. Native Egyptian rulers who still held power in parts of Upper Egypt, particularly around Thebes, never fully accepted Hyksos dominance. These Theban kings, who formed the 17th dynasty, maintained a fragile coexistence with the Hyksos rulers for many years, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. The boundary between the Hyksos-controlled north and the Egyptian south likely lay somewhere near the city of Kusai. Inscriptions and records from this time suggest that trade and communication between the two regions continued, but so did diplomatic posturing and military preparation. One of the earliest signs of rising conflict comes from a tale preserved in later writings. The story of a Hyksos king named Apophis sending a provocative message to the Theban ruler Sekenenre Tau. According to the tale, Apophis complained that the hippopotamuses in Thebes were disturbing his sleep in Avaris, hundreds of miles away. Though likely fictional, the story reflects the growing resentment and political theater of the period. Sekenenre Tau, who ruled in the mid-17th century BCE, appears to have been the first Theban king to actively challenge Hyksos control. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, shows severe head wounds, suggesting he died violently, possibly in battle. He was succeeded by his son Kamosi, who intensified the struggle. Kamosi launched military campaigns northward, striking at Hyksos positions and attempting to cut off their alliances with Nubia to the south. Kamosi's efforts were bold but not fully successful. He died before achieving total victory. However, the momentum he created paved the way for his brother, or possibly nephew, Ahmose, to complete the task. Ahmose would eventually drive the Hyksos out of Egypt entirely, but his achievements belong to the next era in Egyptian history. The Second Intermediate Period was not only marked by the Hyksos. In the south, the kingdom of Kerma in Nubia had grown in strength and began to assert control over regions that had once been under Egyptian influence. Kerma rulers expanded their trade networks, developed monumental architecture, and formed their own powerful state. At times, they allied with the Hyksos, creating a pincer threat to Egyptian rulers trapped in the middle. This situation placed enormous pressure on the Theban rulers. They were surrounded by two powerful foreign forces and yet managed to maintain their independence. The fact that Thebes did not collapse speaks to the resilience and adaptability of its leaders and people. These rulers refined their military, forged stronger political alliances, and reasserted the religious authority of Amun, the local god of Thebes, who would soon become the chief deity of all Egypt. Religiously and culturally, the Second Intermediate Period was a time of both continuity and adaptation. The Hyksos adopted Egyptian royal customs, and the Thebans expanded the cult of Amun, laying the groundwork for the grand temples that would dominate the new kingdom. Artistic styles blended Egyptian and foreign elements, and burial practices continued to evolve. As the Second Intermediate Period came to a close, a powerful transformation began in Egypt, one that would turn it from a fractured kingdom into an expansive and dominant empire. The agent of this transformation was Ahmose, a determined and capable king from Thebes who would become the founder of the 18th dynasty. His success in expelling the Hyksos and reunifying Egypt around 1550 BCE marks the beginning of the New Kingdom, a period that would span nearly 5 centuries and usher in Egypt's most glorious age of wealth, imperial expansion, and cultural development. Ahmose inherited the throne of Thebes as a young man after the efforts of his predecessors, Seqenenre and Kamose, had already weakened the Hyksos stronghold in the north. He continued the campaign against the Hyksos with a renewed sense of purpose and strategic discipline. Through a series of well-organized military offensives, he pushed the Hyksos back to their capital at Avaris and ultimately drove them out of Egypt altogether. Pursuing them into southern Canaan, he ensured that their power would never again threaten Egyptian sovereignty. Ahmose's victory was not only military but also symbolic. It restored Ma'at, order and harmony, to a land long plagued by division. In Egyptian ideology, this was not just the re-establishment of government, but the cosmic restoration of balance. Ahmose was now not just a king. He was a restorer, chosen by the gods. In recognition of his achievements, Ahmose received new titles and honors. He reopened temples, renewed worship of the gods, and commissioned building projects to emphasize divine approval of his reign. Among the gods, Amun of Thebes gained particular prominence. Ahmose credited Amun with his victories and began a tradition of royal patronage that would soon elevate the god from a regional deity to the king of the Egyptian pantheon. The consolidation of power continued under Ahmose's son and successor, Amenhotep I. He inherited a unified and energized kingdom and expanded upon his father's accomplishments. Amenhotep conducted military campaigns in Nubia and established control over key trade routes. This allowed Egypt to access valuable resources such as gold, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. He also promoted architectural projects, particularly in the Theban region, where the tradition of constructing mortuary temples and tombs in the Valley of the Kings was initiated. What followed under the reign of subsequent rulers was a new vision for Egypt, no longer confined to the Nile Valley, but now extending its reach across the ancient Near East. Under Thutmose I, Egypt launched its first major imperial campaigns into the Levant and deep into Nubia. Thutmose led his armies as far as the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria, establishing Egypt as a regional superpower and securing alliances and vassal states that would enrich the kingdom. Thutmose I also began a significant architectural shift by building monumental structures at Karnak, near Thebes. He commissioned the first royal tomb to be constructed in the Valley of the Kings, setting a new precedent for royal burials. The emphasis now was on hidden, protected tombs rather than grand pyramids, which had proven vulnerable to theft. This valley would later become the final resting place for some of Egypt's most iconic pharaohs. The military expansion of the new kingdom brought Egypt into regular contact and often conflict with other major powers of the time, including the Mitanni, Hittites, and various Canaanite city-states. To maintain influence in these regions, the Egyptian state relied on both force and diplomacy, using garrisons, tribute, intermarriage, and trade to manage its far-reaching interests. Domestically, the early New Kingdom rulers reinforced central control by continuing administrative reforms. Bureaucratic positions became more specialized, and a class of professional scribes and officials managed temples, agriculture, trade, and justice. Egypt was becoming more complex and interconnected, with wealth from conquered territories fueling construction, religious activity, and royal patronage. Religion remained central to this structure. The cult of Amun, centered in Thebes, grew exponentially. As pharaohs associated themselves more closely with Amun, the priesthood of this god became extremely powerful. Amun was increasingly seen as the source of royal legitimacy, and vast amounts of land and wealth were granted to his temples. This growing religious institution would later play a critical role in political affairs. One of the defining features of the new kingdom was its use of art and architecture as tools of political messaging. Temples, stelae, and statues proclaimed the might of the king, the favor of the gods, and the strength of the empire. Carvings and reliefs depicted the pharaoh smiting enemies, receiving tribute, or standing beside deities. These images were not merely decorative, they communicated power, divine favor, and the pharaoh's central role in maintaining cosmic order. The new kingdom also saw increased interaction with foreign cultures. As Egypt expanded its borders and trade routes, it absorbed new ideas, technologies, and goods. Materials such as cedar wood from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan flowed into Egyptian workshops and treasuries. Egyptian art began to reflect foreign influences, and diplomatic marriages introduced royal women from neighboring kingdoms into the Egyptian court. In the long history of ancient Egypt, where divine kingship was deeply intertwined with masculinity and tradition, the rise of a female pharaoh was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet in the 15th century BCE, one woman not only assumed the full powers of the throne, but ruled successfully for over 2 decades. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her reign became one of the most prosperous and artistically rich periods in Egyptian history. Far from being a temporary or symbolic figure, Hatshepsut transformed the role of the monarch, expanded Egypt's trade networks, and left behind some of the most iconic monuments of the new kingdom. Hatshepsut was born into the royal household of the 18th dynasty, the daughter of Thutmose I. Her father had expanded Egypt's empire through military conquest, and Hatshepsut was raised in the midst of royal authority and religious tradition. She was married to her half-brother, Thutmose II, following the typical practice of royal sibling marriage intended to preserve dynastic purity. Upon his death, however, the succession became complicated. Thutmose II had left behind a male heir, Thutmose III, but the boy was still a child, too young to rule independently. As a result, Hatshepsut initially took on the role of regent, governing on behalf of the young king. This was not unusual. Royal women often played regency roles during transitions of power. What was unusual is what followed. Within a few years, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh in her own right, adopting full royal titles, wearing the traditional regalia, including the false beard, and commissioning depictions of herself as a male ruler. This act was not a mere power grab, but a carefully constructed political and religious strategy. Hatshepsut framed her accession as divinely ordained. In temple inscriptions, she claimed that the god Amun himself had declared her the rightful ruler of Egypt. This divine endorsement was crucial in legitimizing her position in a society where the concept of kingship was inherently male. Once established as pharaoh, Hatshepsut focused on consolidating power internally and expanding Egypt's wealth and influence abroad, not through warfare, but through trade and diplomacy. One of her most famous achievements was the expedition to the land of Punt, a region believed to lie somewhere along the Red Sea coast, possibly in modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. This expedition, recorded in detailed reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, brought back exotic goods such as myrrh trees, incense, ebony, ivory, and gold. The voyage to Punt was not only a commercial success, but also a powerful statement of Egypt's reach and prosperity under her reign. It demonstrated that a stable and well-managed kingdom could achieve greatness without military conquest. The wealth generated by trade allowed Hatshepsut to invest in ambitious building projects. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, located near Thebes, is considered one of the architectural masterpieces of ancient Egypt. Designed by her close advisor and architect Senenmut, The temple is harmoniously integrated into the cliffs of the western desert and laid out in a series of terraces with colonnades, ramps, and sanctuaries. The temple's walls are covered with reliefs depicting key moments of her reign, including the divine birth narrative, the Punt expedition, and offerings to the gods. These images served not just decorative purposes, but conveyed Hatshepsut's legitimacy, piety, and accomplishments. The temple remains one of the most visited and studied sites in all of ancient Egypt. During her reign, Hatshepsut also restored temples that had been neglected during the turbulent Second Intermediate Period, built obelisks at Karnak, and supported religious festivals and priesthoods. Her close alignment with the cult of Amun reinforced her claim to divine authority, while also strengthening Thebes as a political and religious center. While Hatshepsut emphasized peace and prosperity, she did not neglect Egypt's military needs. There is evidence that she maintained strong defenses and may have undertaken limited campaigns in Nubia and the Levant. However, these actions were not the defining feature of her reign. Instead, she projected power through construction, economic expansion, and ideological messaging. Her co-regency with Thutmose III, the young heir she had initially governed on behalf of, continued throughout her rule. As he matured, he was given increasing military responsibilities, but Hatshepsut remained the dominant political figure. Their relationship appears to have been stable during her lifetime, with no indication of open conflict. However, after Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III began a long and successful reign of his own. Sometime during the latter part of his rule, her memory was deliberately targeted in a campaign of erasure. Her images were chiseled from temple walls, her statues were broken or buried, and her name was omitted from some king lists. With the death of Hatshepsut, the throne of Egypt passed fully into the hands of Thutmose III. Though he had technically been co-ruler during her long reign, it was only now that he emerged as the sole ruler of the two lands. Over the course of more than 50 years of rule, much of it spent campaigning beyond Egypt's borders, Thutmose III would earn a reputation as one of the greatest military leaders in ancient history. Under his command, Egypt reached the peak of its territorial expansion, and his legacy would define the very idea of pharaonic empire. Thutmose III assumed power in a world that had changed significantly during his youth. Hatshepsut's reign had focused on consolidation, internal stability, and economic prosperity. But now Egypt stood poised to assert itself more aggressively across the Near East. The geopolitical context had shifted. The rise of rival powers, such as the Mitanni in northern Syria, and unrest among vassal states in Canaan, threatened Egypt's influence in the region. Thutmose III would respond not with diplomacy, but with a bold and sustained series of military campaigns. His first major expedition took place in his 22nd year of rule, following the death of Hatshepsut. The rebellion of the city of Kadesh and a coalition of Canaanite kings gave him the opportunity to demonstrate his authority. Leading his army northward, he confronted the rebel alliance near the fortress city of Megiddo, a strategically vital location that controlled access between Egypt and the Levant. The campaign culminated in the famous Battle of Megiddo, one of the earliest battles in history for which detailed records survive. According to inscriptions at the Temple of Karnak, Thutmose III personally led his troops through a narrow mountain pass, against the advice of his generals, in a surprise maneuver that allowed him to strike the enemy at their weakest point. The Egyptian victory was decisive. The enemy forces fled to the city of Megiddo, where they were besieged until they surrendered. The triumph at Megiddo was not merely a military success. It reasserted Egypt's dominance over its vassal territories in Canaan and demonstrated the personal leadership and courage of the pharaoh. It also revealed a key aspect of Thutmose's strategy. He did not simply defeat enemies, he incorporated them. Captured leaders were pardoned and reinstated under Egyptian oversight, with hostages and tribute ensuring loyalty. In this way, Thutmose created a network of loyal states stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. Over the next 20 years, Thutmose III conducted at least 15 additional campaigns into the Near East, Nubia, and beyond. Each was meticulously recorded by court scribes and inscribed on the walls of Karnak. These records include lists of conquered towns, spoils of war, and even exotic animals and plants brought back to Egypt. The sheer frequency and organization of these campaigns reflect a highly efficient military apparatus, supported by a robust bureaucracy. In addition to his conquests in Syria and Canaan, Thutmose III also campaigned deep into Nubia. He established Egyptian control far beyond the Second Cataract, building forts and temples to consolidate the southern frontier. Nubia provided Egypt with gold, cattle, and manpower, and its strategic value was well understood by the king. What made Thutmose III's military achievement so significant was not just their scale, but their lasting impact. He created a template for imperial administration that his successors would follow. Egypt was no longer merely a river-bound kingdom. It had become a multinational empire, exerting economic, political, and cultural influence over a vast territory. Thutmose's approach to empire was pragmatic. He allowed local rulers to remain in power so long as they pledged loyalty and paid regular tribute. He took royal children from foreign courts back to Egypt, where they were educated in Egyptian customs before returning home as rulers favorable to Egyptian interests. This strategy ensured political stability while spreading Egyptian culture abroad. Economically, the empire brought immense wealth. Tribute flowed into Egypt in the form of silver, copper, horses, cedar wood, incense, lapis lazuli, and slaves. The influx of wealth funded temple construction, artistic production, and the expansion of the state. The Temple of Amun at Karnak was enlarged significantly during Thutmose's reign, reflecting not only religious devotion but also the central role of Amun's priesthood in legitimizing royal authority. Domestically, Thutmose III undertook numerous building projects. He added to temples across the country, built obelisks and shrines, and erected monumental statues in his likeness. His mortuary temple was constructed in western Thebes, and he commissioned a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tradition established earlier in the dynasty. In the long arc of Egyptian history, few rulers stand out as dramatically as Akhenaten, the pharaoh who defied centuries of religious tradition and introduced one of the most radical ideological experiments of the ancient world. His reign, which began in the mid-14th century BCE, marked a period of extraordinary change, both in the realm of religion and in the visual and cultural expression of kingship itself. The transformation he initiated would later be called the Amarna Revolution, named after the new capital city he built from the ground up. While his reforms would not last beyond his lifetime, they remain one of the most fascinating and controversial episodes in ancient Egypt's story. Akhenaten was born as Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tiye. His father had presided over a wealthy and cosmopolitan Egypt, known for monumental architecture, international diplomacy, and strong connections to the priesthood of Amun. During Amenhotep III's reign, the power of the Amun clergy, centered at Thebes, had grown immensely. Their wealth rivaled that of the royal court, and their political influence was deeply embedded in the machinery of state. It was into this environment that Amenhotep IV ascended the throne. At first, his rule appeared conventional. He upheld many of the same religious practices and built temples honoring the traditional gods. However, within a few years, a profound shift began. He increasingly focused his religious devotion on a lesser-known solar deity called the Aten, a manifestation of the sun disk. What began as preference soon became policy. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. This change was more than symbolic. Akhenaten declared that the Aten was not simply the supreme god, but the only god. In doing so, he effectively introduced a form of monotheism, or at least monolatry, into a deeply polytheistic society. The worship of other deities, especially Amun, was suppressed. Temples to Amun were closed or defaced. His name was removed from inscriptions, and the powerful Amun priesthood lost its state support. The traditional pantheon, which had sustained Egypt's religious life for over a millennium, was swept aside in favor of a singular divine focus on the Aten. To reinforce his religious revolution, Akhenaten moved the capital away from Thebes, the seat of Amun's power, and founded a new city in Middle Egypt called Akhenaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. Today, the site is known as Amarna. Built quickly and on a grand scale, the city was designed as a center for the worship of the Aten and a royal residence free from the old religious and political establishment. At Amarna, Akhenaten oversaw a unique artistic and architectural style that broke sharply with Egyptian tradition. In contrast to the rigid, idealized depictions of earlier pharaohs, Akhenaten was portrayed with exaggerated physical features: elongated face, narrow torso, wide hips, and a protruding belly. These images were not limited to the king. His wife, Nefertiti, and their daughters also appeared in dynamic, intimate scenes that emphasized family closeness and devotion to the Aten. Reliefs often showed the royal family beneath the rays of the sun disk, each ray ending in a hand offering the symbol of life. This new art style, sometimes called the Amarna style, reflected the personal and spiritual emphasis of the Atenist religion. It aimed to portray reality in a more human and emotional way, though how literally these depictions should be interpreted remains debated among scholars. Was Akhenaten truly physically different, or were these images symbolic? The question remains open, but the shift in artistic norms was unmistakable. Akhenaten's religious policies did not stop at art and architecture. He reorganized religious festivals, limited access to temples, and altered the relationship between the king and the divine. In Atenism, the pharaoh was not merely a representative of the gods, but served as the sole intermediary between the Aten and the people. Only through the king and his family could the divine presence be accessed. This centralization of religious authority under the pharaoh further distanced the court from traditional priestly structures. However, this sweeping transformation came at a cost. While Akhenaten focused intensely on religious reform and the development of his new capital, attention to Egypt's imperial interests abroad appears to have waned. Letters found at Amarna, known as the Amarna Letters, reveal correspondence between the Egyptian court and various vassal rulers in Canaan, Syria, and Anatolia. These documents suggest growing unrest among Egypt's allies and a lack of timely military response to calls for support. Whether this neglect was due to Akhenaten's religious focus or broader shifts in power remains uncertain, but the perception of Egypt's disengagement was real. Domestically, the revolution was likely met with confusion and resistance. While the royal court and its artists adopted the new theology and style, the broader population, especially outside Amarna, probably continued traditional worship in private or in secret. The abrupt nature of the reforms and their lack of connection to long-standing traditions meant they had shallow roots in Egyptian society. Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti, played a prominent role during his reign. She was depicted as an equal partner in religious rituals and bore titles that reflected both political and spiritual authority. Some scholars believe that she may have ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death, possibly under the name Neferuaten. Others suggest that a mysterious figure named Smenkhkare succeeded Akhenaten for a short period before the throne passed to a young boy, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, who would later change his name to Tutankhamun, inherited a kingdom in religious turmoil. Still a child, his early reign was guided by advisors who quickly set about reversing Akhenaten's reforms. The capital was moved back to Thebes, traditional deities were restored, and the name of Amun reappeared in official records. The worship of the Aten was abandoned, and efforts were made to erase Akhenaten's legacy. His name and images were removed from monuments, and later king lists omitted his reign entirely. In the wake of the Amarna revolution, Egypt was a kingdom shaken to its foundations. The long-standing religious traditions that had united its people for generations had been overturned by Akhenaten's radical experiment with Atenism. Temples to the traditional gods had been closed, the capital had been relocated, and the priesthood, especially that of Amun, had been cast aside. But now, with Akhenaten's death and the collapse of his religious system, Egypt stood at a crossroads. Into this uncertain landscape stepped a young boy pharaoh who would become one of the most famous names in history, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten, ascended to the throne as a child, likely around 8 or 9 years of age. His parentage is still debated, but many scholars believe he was the son of Akhenaten, perhaps by a lesser wife, rather than Queen Nefertiti. His youth meant he could not rule alone, and so his early reign was directed by powerful advisors, notably the Vizier A and the military commander Horemheb. These two men would ultimately play central roles in Egypt's transition out of the Amarna era. One of the first and most critical steps of Tutankhamun's reign was a deliberate return to traditional religious practices. His name was changed from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amun. This symbolic change was backed by tangible action. Temples to the old gods were reopened, the priesthood of Amun was restored to prominence, and the royal court returned to Thebes, abandoning the city of Akhenaten. This religious restoration, known as the return to orthodoxy, was presented as the will of the gods and the people. Inscriptions from this time speak of the land being in disarray during the previous reigns, and they portray the young king as a restorer of balance and harmony, Ma'at. One famous inscription, the Restoration Stela, declares that the temples were in ruin, the gods had turned away, and offerings had ceased. But now the rightful order had been restored under Tutankhamun. Though he was the face of these reforms, it is clear that his advisors were the architects behind the policies. I and Horemheb likely saw the restoration not only as a religious imperative, but also as a way to strengthen political stability and rebuild ties with traditional centers of power, especially the priesthood and local administrators. The Aten cult had not only disrupted religion, but had also fractured the political machinery that had held Egypt together. Tutankhamun's reign also saw the rebuilding of damaged temples and the commissioning of new monuments. Although many of these were modest in scale compared to the grand works of earlier dynasties, they reflected a conscious effort to repair the cultural fabric of Egypt. His cartouche was added to many temples, including those built by earlier rulers, in a symbolic gesture of continuity and legitimacy. On the foreign front, Egypt remained a significant power, but there is limited evidence of major military campaigns during Tutankhamun's reign. Some historians believe that small expeditions were undertaken in Nubia and possibly in Syria, likely under the command of Horemheb. However, the focus of the government was primarily on domestic recovery, both political and spiritual. Tragically, Tutankhamun's reign was brief. He died in his late teens after ruling for about 9 years. The exact cause of his death remains unclear. Various theories have been proposed, including a chariot accident, genetic disorders, or illness such as malaria. Modern examinations of his mummified remains have revealed a range of health issues, including a possible clubfoot, a broken leg, and signs of multiple infections. Whether these were the result of injury, disease, or inherited conditions due to royal inbreeding is still debated among experts. Because his death came unexpectedly and he left no heirs, Tutankhamun was buried in a relatively small tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb, known as K562, was modest by royal standards and likely repurposed in haste. Despite its limited size, the tomb contained an astonishing wealth of treasures: golden statues, chariots, jewelry, furniture, and, most famously, the golden funerary mask that has become a global symbol of ancient Egypt. The tomb remained hidden and largely undisturbed for over 3,000 years, until its discovery in the early 20th century by British archaeologist Howard Carter. In 1922, Carter and his team uncovered the entrance and, after careful excavation, revealed the virtually intact burial of Tutankhamun. The discovery caused an international sensation and is widely considered the most significant archaeological find of the modern era. The global fascination with Tutankhamun, often called King Tut, did not stem from his accomplishments during life, By historical standards, his reign was short and largely unremarkable, but from the condition and contents of his tomb, most other royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been looted in antiquity. Tutankhamun's tomb, however, preserved a time capsule of New Kingdom art, craftsmanship, and burial customs, offering scholars and the public an unprecedented glimpse into ancient Egyptian life and death. Ironically, the young king, who was nearly erased from history, became one of its most enduring icons. His golden mask, featuring a serene face and inlaid with lapis lazuli, turquoise, and colored glass, is instantly recognizable around the world. Yet his historical significance lies not in his individual rule, but in what his reign represented, a bridge between the upheaval of the Amarna period and the restoration of Egypt's traditional values. Following the restoration of political and religious order under Horemheb and the end of the 18th dynasty, Egypt stood poised for renewed strength and grandeur. The 19th dynasty, established by Ramesses I, ushered in a new line of rulers who would not only consolidate Egypt's power but project it outward through monumental architecture, military campaigns, and diplomacy. Among them, one pharaoh would rise to become a legend in his own time and long after: Ramesses II, also known as Ramses the Great. Ramses II was born to Seti I and Queen Tuya. His father, Seti, was a competent and ambitious ruler who had campaigned in Syria, Lebanon, and Nubia, reasserting Egypt's influence abroad. From an early age, Ramses was groomed for leadership. He was appointed crown prince while still a child, and given command over military and administrative matters well before his ascension. When he became pharaoh, likely in his mid-20s, he would go on to rule for over 60 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. From the beginning of his rule, Ramses II made it clear that his reign would be marked by grand ambition. He initiated a vast program of building across the Egyptian empire, constructing temples, monuments, statues, and cities on a scale that surpassed any of his predecessors. One of his most significant projects was the expansion of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, including the famous hypostyle hall, filled with massive columns carved with elaborate inscriptions and scenes of the king in divine company. He also built the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. It was designed to proclaim his divine status and earthly accomplishments, covered in inscriptions recounting his victories and contributions to Egypt's prosperity. Yet the most iconic of his monuments would be found at Abu Simbel, near the southern border of Egypt. There, two massive rock-cut temples were carved into a cliff face, one dedicated to the gods and the other to Ramses himself, flanked by four colossal seated statues of the king. The purpose of these structures was more than religious. They were also political statements. Abu Simbel, for instance, was positioned to impress and intimidate those entering Egypt from Nubia, symbolizing Egyptian power at the empire's edge. But Ramses II was not only a builder, he was also a warrior. His military campaigns were primarily aimed at maintaining Egyptian dominance in the Near East, particularly against the Hittite Empire, a powerful rival based in Anatolia. The most famous of these campaigns was the Battle of Kadesh, fought in the 5th year of his reign. The battle took place near the city of Kadesh, in what is now modern-day Syria. Ramses led a large Egyptian force to confront the Hittite king Muwatalli II, who had gathered an alliance of vassal states to challenge Egyptian influence. Ramses's accounts of the battle, inscribed in dramatic reliefs on temples across Egypt, describe how he was caught in an ambush but fought valiantly, rallying his troops and turning the tide of battle. In these inscriptions, Ramses presents himself as a lone hero, abandoned by his army, but saved by divine favor and his own courage. Whether this version is historically accurate is debated. Modern historians believe the battle was likely a tactical stalemate, with neither side achieving decisive victory. However, Ramses's portrayal of the event was a brilliant act of royal propaganda. By turning a draw into a personal triumph, he reinforced his image as a warrior king blessed by the gods. Years after the battle, Ramses and the Hittites would take a different path. diplomacy. Around 2 decades into his reign, he signed what is widely considered the world's first known peace treaty with Hatshepsut III, the successor to Muwatalli II. This treaty, written in both Egyptian and Hittite, outlined terms of mutual non-aggression, military alliance, and the extradition of fugitives. Copies of the treaty survive in inscriptions at Karnak and in clay tablets found in Hattusa, the Hittite capital. The treaty not only ended hostilities but also paved the way for diplomatic marriages. Ramses married at least one Hittite princess, and possibly more, integrating foreign royalty into the Egyptian court. These alliances marked a shift from conquest to cooperation and symbolized Egypt's standing as a mature, stable power capable of influencing international relations. Beyond politics and war, Ramses II also oversaw a period of economic prosperity. Trade flourished under his rule, with goods flowing from Nubia, the Levant, and beyond. The state mobilized vast resources for construction and temple activities, and workers were organized in a highly structured system, particularly at places like Deir el-Medina, the village of the tomb builders in Thebes. His reign also featured a strong religious dimension. Ramses was closely identified with the gods, especially Amun, Ra, and Ptah. In many of his statues, he is portrayed as nearly divine, with features idealized to reflect eternal youth and strength. His self-representation blurred the line between human king and god, reinforcing his supreme authority and divine right to rule. Despite his long reign and immense influence, Ramses was not without challenges. Toward the end of his rule, signs of strain began to appear. Grain shortages, labor unrest, and rising demands from temples strained the royal treasury. Nonetheless, he remained firmly in control until his death, likely in his early 90s, a remarkable age for the ancient world. Ramses was buried in the Valley of the Kings, though his tomb was looted in antiquity. His mummy was later found in a royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, remarkably well preserved. His facial features, with high cheekbones and a prominent nose, became the face of ancient Egypt for many modern observers. The long and prosperous reign of Ramses II marked a golden age in Egyptian history, but it also stood as the high watermark of the new kingdom's power. What followed in the later years of the 19th and throughout the 20th dynasties was a gradual and complicated decline. Egypt remained an important and culturally rich civilization, yet it faced mounting internal challenges, economic troubles, and external pressures that it could not overcome. By the close of the New Kingdom, the once mighty empire was weakened, fragmented, and vulnerable to foreign invasions. After Ramses II's death, his son Merneptah inherited the throne. Merneptah was already advanced in age and had served in various military and administrative roles under his father. His reign was marked by immediate threats from outside Egypt's borders, particularly from the west. Libyan tribes, driven by drought and pressure from other migrating peoples, attempted to enter and settle in the western delta. Merneptah responded with force, and records from his reign describe a significant military victory over the Libyans and their allies. Perhaps the most famous artifact from Merneptah's rule is the Merneptah Stele, a monumental inscription that not only celebrates his military triumphs, but also contains the earliest known reference to Israel in any historical record. This brief mention appears in the context of a campaign in Canaan, suggesting that Egypt was still active in its imperial provinces, even as its control was weakening. The succession after Merneptah was uncertain. A brief power struggle followed, involving his son Seti II and a rival named Amenmesse. This instability foreshadowed the broader issues Egypt would face in the coming decades. The royal family lost its firm grip on power, and internal court intrigue began to weaken centralized authority. One of the last significant rulers of the 19th dynasty was Queen Tusret, one of the few women to rule as pharaoh. Her reign, though short, was followed by civil unrest and the eventual rise of a new line of kings, the 20th dynasty, founded by Setnacht. Setnacht came to power during a time of deep national disarray. Tomb robberies, famine, and regional unrest signaled the erosion of stability that had once defined the new kingdom. His son, Ramesses III, attempted to restore Egypt's glory and is often considered the last great pharaoh of the new kingdom. Ramesses III faced one of the greatest threats to Egypt in its entire history, the arrival of the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples were a confederation of naval raiders and migrant groups whose exact origins remain unclear. They appeared suddenly in the historical record in the eastern Mediterranean during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. These groups attacked cities across Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus, contributing to the collapse of several major civilizations, including the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean kingdoms. Egypt, too, was in their path. In the 8th year of his reign, Ramesses III led Egypt's defense against a massive invasion by the Sea Peoples, who came not only as warriors, but with their families, ox carts, and supplies, suggesting a full-scale migration. Ramses met them by land and sea, and according to the inscriptions at Medinet Habu, he achieved a decisive victory, preserving Egypt from the same fate that befell its neighbors. The scenes at Medinet Habu are among the most detailed battle records in Egyptian history. They show chaotic naval clashes, rows of captured prisoners, and Ramses standing triumphant. While Egypt survived, the cost was great. The economic and military strain of these conflicts, combined with internal corruption and labor unrest, left the state deeply weakened. Ramses III's reign also saw the earliest recorded labor strike in history. At Deir el-Medina, the village of tomb builders near Thebes, workers stopped their work and protested delays in grain payments. Their complaints were documented on papyri and show that economic hardship was affecting even the most essential and protected parts of society. After the death of Ramses III, the 20th dynasty fell into decline. His successors, Ramses IV through Ramses XI, bore his name but not his authority or capability. These later kings presided over a shrinking kingdom. Tombs were robbed, resources dwindled, and civil disorder increased. Even the Valley of the Kings, once a sacred burial ground, became unsafe. Mummies of past kings were hidden or relocated by priests trying to protect them from looters. One significant development during this period was the increasing power of the high priests of Amun at Thebes. As the pharaohs grew weaker, the priesthood grew stronger, both spiritually and economically. By the end of the New Kingdom, the high priest of Amun effectively ruled southern Egypt, while the pharaoh in the north retained only symbolic authority. This division of power was a clear sign of fragmentation and the end of centralized rule. The breakdown of state control led to a rise in regionalism. In some areas, local leaders governed independently, issuing decrees and building monuments in their own names. Egypt had not collapsed entirely, but it had lost the cohesion and reach that had defined the earlier New Kingdom. The bureaucracy still functioned, temples were still active, and art continued to be produced, but on a diminished scale and with a tone of nostalgia for the greatness of the past. As the sun set on the New Kingdom, Egypt entered a long and complex chapter in its history known as the Third Intermediate Period. Spanning roughly from the end of the 12th century BCE to the mid-7th century BCE, this era was defined not by grand conquests or monument-building pharaohs, but by political fragmentation, shifting centers of power, and the growing influence of foreign peoples within Egypt's borders. Though often viewed as a time of decline, the Third Intermediate Period was also one of adaptation, regional resilience, and cultural survival. The defining characteristic of this period was the division of authority between the north and south. In the north, the city of Tanis became a new seat of royal power under the 21st dynasty. These kings, beginning with Smendes, claimed the legacy of the great New Kingdom rulers but were largely limited in their influence to the Delta region. Their authority rested more on maintaining religious and bureaucratic continuity than on military or territorial expansion. Meanwhile, in southern Egypt, centered in Thebes, the high priests of Amun had become the de facto rulers. This rise of the priesthood had already begun in the late New Kingdom. But by the early Third Intermediate period, the high priest held not only spiritual authority, but also political control. The priestly families became hereditary elites, commanding both temple wealth and military support. This division of power between the Tanite kings in the north and the Theban priests in the south was not necessarily one of open hostility. At times, marriage alliances and shared interests maintained a balance. Yet Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom under a single pharaoh. Instead, it had become a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions, each asserting its own influence. Further complicating the political landscape was the increasing involvement of Libyans in Egyptian affairs. During the late New Kingdom, Libyan tribes had settled in the western delta, some as prisoners of war and others as mercenaries or immigrants. Over generations, these communities integrated into Egyptian society and eventually rose to positions of power. By the time of the 22nd dynasty, founded by Shoshenq I, Libyan rulers had fully entered the Egyptian royal tradition. Shoshenq, known in the Bible as Shishak, is famous for invading Judah and plundering the temple in Jerusalem. His reign marked a renewed attempt to restore central authority and reassert Egyptian influence abroad. Shoshenq undertook military campaigns into Canaan and left detailed inscriptions at Karnak commemorating his conquests. Though his efforts momentarily strengthened Egypt's position, they did not lead to lasting unity. Subsequent rulers of Libyan descent governed from various regional centers, and Egypt once again splintered into competing dynasties. By the time of the 23rd dynasty, multiple kings ruled simultaneously over different parts of the country. During this era, Egypt's international influence continued to wane. Assyria rose as a dominant power in the Near East, and local kingdoms in the Levant reasserted their independence. Egypt, once a mighty imperial force, now struggled to project its power beyond its borders. Despite political disunity, the period saw continued cultural development. Temples remained active centers of religious and economic life, and regional elites continued to sponsor art, architecture, and literature. Tombs from this period, particularly in Thebes, reveal an evolving artistic style that blended older traditions with new influences. One of the most distinctive developments was the emergence of royal burials in the Libyan style, featuring reused coffins and decorated burial chambers with complex scenes of the afterlife. These burials reflected both continuity with Egypt's past and the practical constraints of a more modest economy. The Valley of the Kings was largely abandoned, and many New Kingdom tombs were looted or repurposed during this time. Another important feature of the Third Intermediate period was the increasing role of Nubia in Egyptian affairs. As the 25th dynasty would soon demonstrate, power was not only shifting internally but was also moving southward, toward a kingdom that had long been influenced by Egyptian culture but was now becoming a power in its own right. The presence of Libyan dynasties ruling in Egypt raised complex questions about identity and legitimacy. These rulers adopted traditional Egyptian titles, rituals, and iconography. They built temples, made offerings to the gods, and were buried with pharaonic regalia. To many Egyptians, they were legitimate successors. Yet, their foreign origins and decentralized rule reflected broader changes in Egyptian society. Communication and diplomacy became increasingly important as different regions negotiated alliances and asserted autonomy. In some cases, local rulers even took on royal titles independently, creating overlapping claims to kingship. This complex situation is documented in fragmented inscriptions, stelae, and temple reliefs scattered across the country. As the period progressed, Egypt faced growing pressure from the expanding Assyrian Empire to the northeast. By the 8th century BCE, Assyrian kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II had conquered much of the Levant and began to look toward Egypt with strategic interest. The fractured state of Egypt made it an inviting target. As Egypt continued to grapple with political fragmentation during the Third Intermediate period, a new power was quietly rising in the south. In the region known as Nubia, modern-day northern Sudan, a kingdom had emerged with strong cultural and religious ties to ancient Egypt. This kingdom, called Kush, had absorbed Egyptian traditions over centuries of contact, including language, religious practices, royal iconography, and temple architecture. By the 8th century BCE, the rulers of Kush would not only see themselves as legitimate heirs to Egypt's ancient legacy, they would act upon that vision and conquer the two lands. Thus began the 25th dynasty, often called the Nubian or Kushite dynasty, a chapter that saw Africa's southern kingdom rise to power and take its place on the Egyptian throne. The city of Napata, located near the fourth cataract of the Nile, became the religious and political center of the Kushite kingdom. Its kings were devout worshippers of the god Amun and constructed temples in his honor, modeled after the great sanctuaries of Karnak and Thebes. This deep devotion to Egyptian religion was no mere imitation. For the Nubians, Amun represented a sacred and unifying force, and their claim to rule Egypt was grounded in both religious authority and dynastic continuity. The first major figure to emerge from this context was King Alara, credited with laying the foundations of the Napatan state. However, it was his successor, King Kashta, who made the first real move toward Egypt. Kashta advanced northward into Upper Egypt and managed to install his daughter, Amenirtis, as the divine adoratress of Amun in Thebes. This priestly office, held by royal women, carried significant religious and political influence in southern Egypt. By securing this position for his daughter, Kashta effectively extended Kushite control into Egypt without the need for military conflict. The real turning point came under Kashta's son, Piye. Known in older sources as Pianki, Piye reigned during a time of deep division in Egypt. Multiple local rulers held power across the country, especially in the Delta region, while Thebes acknowledged Kushite authority. Around the mid-8th century BCE, Piye launched a military campaign to unify Egypt under his rule. His efforts were not simply opportunistic. They were framed as a religious mission to restore order and piety. Piye's campaign is one of the most well-documented military actions of the ancient world, thanks to the Victory Stela found at his temple in Napata. This inscription provides detailed accounts of his march through Egypt, the cities he conquered, and the rulers who submitted to him. According to the text, Piye insisted on proper rituals and purification during the campaign, even interrupting military operations to observe religious festivals. He successfully captured key cities, including Memphis, and received the submission of several Delta rulers. However, Piye did not establish his permanent capital in Egypt. Instead, he returned to Napata, content to rule from the south while maintaining a network of loyal governors and religious officials in Egypt. His policy reflected a broader Kushite pattern of blending military authority with religious legitimacy. After Piye, the succession passed to his brother Shabaka, who would formally consolidate Kushite rule over all of Egypt and establish the 25th dynasty. Unlike Piye, Shabaka made his seat of power in Egypt, reaffirming the dynasty's commitment to governing the land of the pharaohs. He adopted traditional Egyptian royal titulary and conducted extensive building and restoration projects, especially in Thebes and Memphis. Shabaka's reign is notable for a cultural and religious revival. Temples were restored, priesthoods re-established, and ancient texts recopied and preserved. One of the most famous artifacts from his reign is the Shabaka stone, an inscription that claims to be a transcription of an earlier, worm-eaten papyrus containing a theological treatise from the Old Kingdom. This act of cultural preservation highlights the Nubian pharaohs' commitment to reviving what they saw as the true Egyptian tradition. Following Shabaka, his successor Shabitku continued the dynasty's policies, although rising tensions in the Near East soon posed new challenges. The expansion of the Assyrian Empire under kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II began to shift the political balance in the eastern Mediterranean. Assyria had already conquered much of the Levant, and it now looked toward Egypt. The greatest confrontation between Egypt and Assyria came during the reign of Taharqa, perhaps the most famous of the Nubian pharaohs. Taharqa had a long and active reign, marked by both ambitious construction and intense military conflict. He is mentioned in biblical texts as an ally of the Kingdom of Judah during its resistance to Assyria. Taharqa initially attempted to halt Assyrian expansion by supporting anti-Assyrian coalitions in the Levant. However, the Assyrian response was swift and overwhelming. Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt in the early 7th century BCE. He successfully captured Memphis and declared victory, though Taharqa continued to resist from the south. The Assyrians returned again under Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon's successor, and eventually expelled Taharqa and his nephew and successor, Tutankhamun, from Egypt. The Assyrians installed their own puppet rulers in the delta, effectively ending Nubian control over the country. Though the military defeat was decisive, the legacy of the 25th dynasty endured. The Nubian pharaohs had ruled Egypt for nearly a century. They brought a renewed emphasis on piety, temple building, and respect for ancient traditions. Their distinctive artistic style, characterized by strong facial features, tightly curled hair, and compact statuary, remains a recognizable chapter in Egyptian art. By the beginning of the 7th century BCE, Egypt had once again become the focus of foreign powers. After centuries of alternating unity and fragmentation, a new force emerged to challenge Egypt's sovereignty, not from within its borders or the south, but from the northeast. The Assyrian Empire, centered in Mesopotamia, had transformed itself into one of the most aggressive and militarized empires of the ancient world. Its rulers expanded their influence through a combination of brutal military campaigns and efficient administrative control. Egypt, weakened by internal divisions and the recent expulsion of the Nubian dynasty, soon became a target of their imperial ambitions. The Assyrian interest in Egypt was not new. Since the time of the late New Kingdom, Egypt had meddled in the affairs of the Levant and attempted to resist the growing Assyrian presence in the region. The 25th dynasty, especially under Taharqa, had actively supported anti-Assyrian coalitions in the Levant, including the kingdoms of Judah and Tyre. From the Assyrian perspective, Egypt was a persistent, destabilizing force that needed to be subdued. The first serious clash came during the reign of Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria. Around the early decades of the 7th century BCE, Esarhaddon launched a full-scale military campaign against Egypt. His objectives were clear: to remove the Kushite pharaoh Taharqa from power, punish his allies in the Levant, and bring Egypt under Assyrian control. The campaign was brutal and swift. Assyrian records describe how Esarhaddon marched through the Levant, subduing rebellious cities, and then invaded the Nile Delta. Memphis, the traditional capital of northern Egypt, was captured by the Assyrians. Taharqa fled south, retreating into Upper Egypt and back toward Nubia. Esarhaddon declared victory, looted the Egyptian cities he conquered, and brought Egyptian nobles and members of the royal family back to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. One surviving inscription from the Assyrian archives boasts of Esarhaddon's success. "I tore out the root of Cush from Egypt." But the conquest was not yet complete. Though Memphis had fallen, Upper Egypt remained beyond Assyrian control. Taharqa regrouped and launched counteroffensives from the south, managing to retake parts of Egypt and reignite resistance in some northern cities. This back-and-forth struggle revealed the limits of Assyrian power and the resilience of Egyptian regional rulers. Esarhaddon died before he could mount a second campaign. His son, Ashurbanipal, one of the last great kings of Assyria, inherited the task. Ashurbanipal proved even more ruthless than his father. In response to Taharqa's renewed activity, he launched a devastating invasion aimed not only at the Nubian forces, but also at the Egyptian elites who had supported them. By this time, Taharqa had died and was succeeded by his nephew, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun attempted to continue the fight and briefly reclaimed Memphis. His ambition was to restore the full unity of Egypt under Nubian rule. However, his reign would be the last stand of the Kushite pharaohs in Egypt. Ashurbanipal's response was overwhelming. In a campaign carried out around the middle of the 7th century BCE, he marched deep into Egypt, defeating Tutankhamun and pursuing him southward. The most symbolic blow came with the capture and sack of Thebes, the great religious and cultural capital of Upper Egypt. Thebes, long a center of Amun worship and the heartland of Egyptian religious life, was looted and burned. Its temples were desecrated, treasures carried off, and its people humiliated. The Assyrian inscriptions describe the event with characteristic pride. One account boasts that the city was left as a ruin, like a flood, a phrase meant to convey total destruction. While later archaeological evidence suggests that Thebes was not completely razed and continued to exist afterward, the sack marked a turning point. Never again would Thebes be a seat of power in Egypt, as it had been during the great dynastic eras. With the withdrawal of Tutankhamun and the collapse of Nubian authority, Assyria installed local rulers in the delta who were loyal to its interests. The most notable among these was Psamtik, a Libyan-descended prince from Sais in the western delta. Backed by Assyrian approval, Psamtik gradually consolidated power and established himself as a strong regional leader. Though nominally an Assyrian vassal, he began to act with increasing independence. The Assyrian presence in Egypt, though powerful, was never fully stable. The empire was overextended, managing rebellions in Babylon and wars in the east. Egypt proved difficult to hold due to its geography, long distance from Mesopotamia, and the continued resistance of its local population. The Egyptian climate, landscape, and military tactics were unfamiliar to the Assyrians, and they faced logistical challenges in projecting their power so far from their heartland. Eventually, Assyrian attention shifted elsewhere, and their grip on Egypt loosened. Taking advantage of this moment, Psamtik declared himself king and founded the 26th dynasty, also known as the Saite Dynasty. His rise marked the beginning of a brief Egyptian Renaissance, during which Egypt would reclaim a degree of autonomy and attempt to restore its past glories. Despite its relatively short duration, the Assyrian conquest had far-reaching consequences. It ended centuries of uninterrupted Egyptian rule by native or closely related dynasties and signaled a new age of imperial vulnerability. Egypt had been conquered by a foreign power, one that did not merely influence Egyptian politics but directly occupied and controlled its cities, sacked its temples, and appointed its officials. It also marked a transition in how Egypt engaged with the wider world. The pharaohs of the past had seen themselves as the center of civilization, with foreign lands as tributaries or adversaries. Now, Egypt was forced to adapt to a world of shifting alliances, rising empires, and increasingly globalized political dynamics. In the wake of the Assyrian conquest and the sack of Thebes, Egypt found itself once again divided and struggling for cohesion. The mighty Nubian pharaohs had been expelled, and the Assyrians, though victorious, did not establish long-term occupation beyond securing influence through local rulers. From this fragile environment emerged a new dynasty that sought not just to restore Egypt's independence, but to revive its ancient heritage. This was the 26th dynasty, often referred to as the Saite Dynasty, named after its capital at the city of Sais in the western Nile Delta. The founder of this dynasty was Psamtik I, a descendant of the Libyan military elite that had been integrated into Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period. Psamtik had originally been installed as a governor under Assyrian oversight, but quickly proved to be both politically astute and militarily capable. Seizing upon the weakening of Assyrian authority in the Near East, he consolidated his power in the Delta and began to assert independence. Over time, he expelled rival local rulers and reunified Egypt under his control. Psamtik I's reign marked the beginning of what historians call the Saite Renaissance, a period characterized by renewed interest in Egypt's Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom traditions, increased centralization, economic recovery, and vibrant cultural expression. It was a revival not only of political unity, but of identity, an intentional looking back to the golden ages of Egyptian greatness. One of Psamtik's key strategies in rebuilding Egypt was the employment of foreign mercenaries. He recruited skilled Greek and Carian soldiers to serve in his army, stationing them at military garrisons like those at Daphne in the eastern delta. This marked a significant turning point in Egyptian foreign policy. Rather than resisting the growing influence of Mediterranean powers, Psamtik embraced it, bringing Greek warriors, traders, and craftsmen into the fabric of Egyptian society. The city of Naucratis in the western delta became a major center for Greek trade and cultural exchange during this period. It was established as a Greek trading post under Egyptian regulation, and it flourished with temples dedicated to both Greek and Egyptian gods. This blending of cultures would have a lasting effect, laying the groundwork for the later Hellenistic period that would follow Alexander the Great's conquest. Psamtik's rule also emphasized religious orthodoxy and temple restoration. His government promoted the cults of traditional gods, particularly Amun, Osiris, and Ptah, and supported the priesthoods that had lost their influence during previous eras of foreign dominance. Temples that had fallen into disrepair were rebuilt, including those at Memphis, Thebes, and Sais. This religious patronage was not only an act of devotion, it was a political statement, re-establishing the king's role as upholder of Ma'at and defender of the gods. Psamtik I was succeeded by his son Necho II, who continued many of his father's policies but also pursued more ambitious foreign projects. Necho is perhaps best known for initiating large-scale infrastructure programs and attempting to revive Egypt's role as a naval power. According to later Greek sources, including Herodotus, Necho sponsored an expedition that may have circumnavigated Africa by sailing from the Red Sea around the continent and back to the Mediterranean, a feat that, if true, would have been remarkable for the time. More concretely, Necho focused on controlling trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. He began work on a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, a precursor to the modern Suez Canal, though the project was left unfinished. He also engaged in military campaigns to reassert Egyptian influence in the Levant, particularly in the face of rising Babylonian power. One of the most significant military events during Necho's reign was the Battle of Carchemish, fought between Babylon and an Egyptian army allied with the remnants of the Assyrian Empire. The Egyptian forces were defeated by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, marking the end of Egypt's ambitions in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Following Necho, the Saite line continued under Psamtik II, who led expeditions into Nubia and maintained internal stability. His successor, Apries, struggled with military setbacks and domestic unrest. Discontent with his leadership eventually led to a revolt, and he was overthrown by Ramesses, a general who declared himself pharaoh. Ramesses, known as Thutmose II in Egyptian, would prove to be one of the most effective rulers of the dynasty. His reign brought economic prosperity, administrative reform, and deeper engagement with the Mediterranean world. He continued to support the growing Greek presence in Egypt, allowing further Greek settlement and encouraging the growth of Naucratis. Greek mercenaries formed an important part of the Egyptian army, and Greek merchants played a role in the country's thriving trade networks. Under Ramesses, Egypt exported grain, papyrus, linen, and precious goods in exchange for silver, wine, and luxury items. The economy was robust, temples were endowed, and the court became a hub of cultural activity. Ramesses also maintained traditional Egyptian forms of governance, carefully balancing innovation with reverence for the past. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, new dangers loomed. To the east, the Persian Empire, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great and later Cambyses, was rising rapidly. Persia had already conquered much of Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, absorbing the former territories of Assyria and Babylon. Egypt remained one of the last major independent kingdoms in the region. When Ramesses died, his son Psamtik III inherited the throne. His reign would be short and tumultuous. In a campaign led by Cambyses, the Persian army invaded Egypt around the middle of the 6th century BCE. Psamtik III attempted to resist the invasion, but was ultimately defeated at the Battle of Pelusium. According to later accounts, the Persians used psychological tactics during the battle, such as placing sacred animals, believed to be cats, symbols of the goddess Bastet, on their shields, knowing the Egyptians would hesitate to strike. With the fall of Psamtik III to Cambyses, the king of Persia, Egypt entered a new era, one in which its sovereignty would be increasingly shaped by the ambitions of foreign empires. The conquest by Persia in the mid-6th century BCE marked the beginning of Egypt's first Persian period, also known as the 27th Dynasty. Although Egypt retained much of its internal cultural and religious life, it was now part of a vast empire stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. While Persian rule brought administrative integration and some measure of stability, it also triggered a series of Egyptian rebellions, episodes of cultural resistance, and a deepening sense of national identity. Cambyses, son of Cyrus the Great, entered Egypt as a conqueror, but sought to present himself as a legitimate pharaoh. Upon taking Memphis, he participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, paid respect to native deities, and claimed the royal titles in accordance with tradition. He ordered that his name be inscribed on temple walls and offered donations to major cult centers, including those of Neith in Sais and Ptah in Memphis. By adopting the external forms of pharaonic rule, the Persians hoped to stabilize their new province and win the support of Egypt's powerful priesthoods. However, Cambyses' efforts to rule as a traditional Egyptian king met with mixed success. While some temples cooperated, others remained suspicious or quietly resisted. The priesthoods, long accustomed to autonomy and lavish royal patronage, now found themselves under the control of distant foreign rulers who did not fully share their values or understand the sacred nuances of Egyptian belief. Classical Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, depict Cambyses as a tyrannical and impious figure who insulted Egyptian religion, killed sacred animals, and defiled temples. According to these accounts, Cambyses even struck the statue of the god Ptah and killed the Apis bull, a sacred animal worshipped in Memphis. Modern scholars approach such claims with caution, recognizing the strong anti-Persian bias in later Greek writing. Still, it is clear that Cambyses struggled to maintain support within Egypt, and his rule was marked by tension. After Cambyses' sudden death, a period of instability followed in the Persian Empire. Darius I, one of the most capable Persian rulers, eventually secured the throne and reasserted control over Egypt. Like Cambyses, Darius adopted the full titulary of a pharaoh and paid close attention to Egyptian customs. His reign brought several administrative reforms and economic projects aimed at better integrating Egypt into the empire. One of Darius's most notable accomplishments was the completion of a canal connecting the Nile River to the Red Sea. This canal, an early version of what would much later become the Suez Canal, allowed goods and ships to travel more efficiently between Egypt and Persia's eastern territories. Inscriptions along the canal, written in Egyptian, Persian, and other languages, proclaim Darius as the one who united the seas. Darius also commissioned the codification of Egyptian laws and preserved much of the temple structure, allowing religious institutions to function with a degree of continuity. Temples continued to receive offerings, festivals were observed, and local deities remained central to daily life. Egyptian artisans and scribes continued their work, blending traditional forms with Persian artistic motifs. Despite this relative cultural stability, resentment toward foreign rule persisted. Rebellions broke out intermittently throughout the First Persian period. The most notable of these occurred during the reign of Xerxes, Darius's successor. Around the early 5th century BCE, revolts erupted in both the Delta and Upper Egypt. Although quickly suppressed, these uprisings reflected the growing frustration of Egyptians who longed for native rule. Persian administrators responded to resistance with a mixture of tolerance and force. Taxes were levied more heavily, and some temples lost lands or funding. Meanwhile, Persian garrisons ensured order in key cities, and military governors, often drawn from outside Egypt, oversaw strategic regions. While the empire's reach remained firm, it never fully rooted itself in the hearts of the Egyptian people. By the late 5th century BCE, during the reign of Artaxerxes I, Egypt once again became a center of rebellion. A native prince named Inaros, supported by Greek mercenaries from Athens, led a major revolt in the Delta. The rebels won several early victories and even captured parts of Memphis. The revolt lasted several years, but the Persians eventually crushed it with great force. Inaros was captured and, according to Greek accounts, executed in Susa. This episode highlighted a new development in Egyptian geopolitics: the growing involvement of the Greeks. Greek city-states, particularly Athens and later Sparta, increasingly saw Egypt as a strategic partner in their conflicts with Persia. Egyptian rebels, in turn, relied on Greek military support. These alliances would shape the future course of Egyptian politics and foreshadow the coming of Hellenistic influence. The First Persian period finally came to an end in the early 4th century BCE, when a series of successful revolts re-established native Egyptian rule. The most prominent of these was led by Amyrtaeus, a descendant of the former royal house of Sais. Amyrtaeus managed to expel the Persian forces and declared himself pharaoh, inaugurating the 28th dynasty, the first native dynasty since the Saite period. Though Amyrtaeus ruled for only a few years, his success encouraged the rise of subsequent native dynasties, including the 29th and 30th. These rulers, while often short-lived and facing continuous threats from the east, made renewed efforts to restore Egyptian traditions, rebuild temples, and reassert autonomy. The 30th dynasty, particularly under Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II, marked a final flowering of Egyptian native rule. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh of Egypt, invested heavily in religious and architectural projects, seeking to revive the glories of old. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, Egypt had been brought once again under foreign control. The Persian Empire, now in its second period of dominance, had imposed harsher policies and heavier taxation on its Egyptian subjects. Temples were desecrated, resistance was crushed, and the ancient land of the Nile seemed a shadow of its former grandeur. But across the eastern Mediterranean, the political landscape was shifting. A new power was rising in the north, one that would forever alter the course of Egyptian history. That power was Macedonia, and its agent of change was Alexander the Great. Born to King Philip II of Macedon, Alexander had been educated by the philosopher Aristotle and trained in the arts of war and governance. After his father's assassination, Alexander assumed the throne and swiftly launched a campaign of conquest unlike any the world had seen before. His aim was to topple the Persian Empire and unite the Greek world under his rule. Egypt, as a satrapy of Persia, became one of his primary objectives. In the year that corresponds to the late 330s BCE, Alexander entered Egypt without resistance. The Persian satrap, perhaps anticipating the might of the Macedonian forces, surrendered peacefully. For the Egyptians, long weary of Persian oppression, the arrival of Alexander was not seen as another foreign invasion, but as a liberation. They welcomed him as a savior and, in time, would accept him as a legitimate pharaoh. Alexander was keenly aware of the importance of presenting himself as more than a conqueror. He understood the deep cultural pride of the Egyptians and moved quickly to adopt their traditions. He traveled to Memphis, performed religious ceremonies in honor of the local gods, and was crowned in accordance with pharaonic custom. By aligning himself with Egyptian religious expectations, Alexander legitimized his rule and won the loyalty of the priesthood. But perhaps the most symbolic act of his time in Egypt was his journey to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, deep in the western desert. There, in a remote temple revered by Egyptians and Libyans alike, the oracle is said to have greeted Alexander as the son of Amun. This declaration, whether myth or historical fact, was crucial to Alexander's evolving self-image. He began to portray himself not merely as a king, but as a semi-divine figure, a son of Zeus Amun, destined to rule the world. While in Egypt, Alexander founded one of his most enduring legacies, the city of Alexandria. Located on the Mediterranean coast near the Canopic branch of the Nile, the site was chosen for its strategic location and access to maritime trade. Alexander designed the plan of the city himself, entrusting its construction to his Greek engineers. Although he would leave Egypt before seeing it completed, Alexandria would grow to become one of the most important cultural and economic centers of the ancient world. Shortly after laying the foundations of Alexandria, Alexander departed Egypt to continue his campaign eastward. He would go on to defeat Darius III of Persia, conquer vast territories across Asia, and extend his empire to the borders of India. But in the year that corresponds to the late 320s BCE, at the age of only 32, Alexander died in the city of Babylon under circumstances that remain unclear. With Alexander's sudden death, the fate of his vast empire was thrown into uncertainty. His generals, known as the Diadochi, fought among themselves for control of different regions. Egypt fell to one of his most trusted commanders, Ptolemy, who declared himself satrap and later king. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a new chapter in Egypt's long history, one shaped by the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures. The transition from Pharaonic Egypt to Hellenistic Egypt did not mean the erasure of the old ways. In fact, the Ptolemies were careful to adopt many aspects of traditional Egyptian kingship. They presented themselves as pharaohs, performed the necessary religious rituals, and patronized the great temples of the land. They supported the cult of Amun, commissioned hieroglyphic inscriptions, and allowed the priesthood to function as before. At the same time, the Ptolemies introduced Greek political and administrative systems, language, and urban planning. Alexandria, in particular, was developed into a truly Hellenistic city, complete with Greek-style institutions, theaters, gymnasia, and marketplaces. The city's population was diverse, including Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, and other peoples from across the Mediterranean. One of the greatest achievements of early Ptolemaic rule was the creation of the Library of Alexandria. Intended as a center of knowledge and scholarship, the library sought to collect all the written works of the known world. It attracted scholars, philosophers, and scientists from across the Greek-speaking world, becoming a beacon of intellectual life. Alongside the library was the museum, a place of study and residence for scholars funded by the state. Though Greek became the language of administration and the ruling elite, the Egyptian language and writing systems continued to be used, particularly in religious and rural contexts. Temples across the country continued to operate in the traditional style, with priests maintaining rituals that had been performed for centuries. This coexistence of cultures did not mean equality. The Greek elite often held privileged positions in government, the military, and the economy. Tensions occasionally arose between the native Egyptian population and the Greek rulers. Rebellions did occur, especially in Upper Egypt, where attachment to older traditions was strongest. Yet for several generations, the Ptolemaic dynasty managed to maintain stability and prosperity. With the death of Alexander the Great and the subsequent division of his empire among his generals, Egypt fell into the hands of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable and trusted commanders. Unlike some of the other Diadochi who sought to hold the empire together, Ptolemy had a clear and focused vision: to make Egypt his own. In doing so, he established the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule for nearly 3 centuries and mark the final chapter of ancient Egyptian monarchy. It was a period defined by cultural fusion, great learning, dynastic intrigue, and eventually, tragic entanglement with the rising power of Rome. At the heart of this story stands one of the most iconic figures of ancient history, Cleopatra VII. Ptolemy, later known as Ptolemy I Soter, declared himself king of Egypt not long after Alexander's death. From the beginning, he adopted the dual role of Hellenistic monarch and Egyptian pharaoh. He wore traditional Egyptian regalia in temple ceremonies, supported the priesthood, and was depicted in hieroglyphic inscriptions as a son of the gods. Yet, at the same time, he ruled as a Greek king surrounded by Macedonian courtiers, speaking Greek, and governing from his new capital, Alexandria. Under Ptolemy I and his successors, Alexandria blossomed into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Strategically located on the Mediterranean coast, it became a hub of commerce, politics, and culture. The city boasted wide avenues, marble buildings, palaces, theaters, and harbors filled with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. It was also home to the famous Library of Alexandria and the associated Museion, institutions that turned the city into a beacon of learning and scholarship. The Ptolemies continued to support traditional Egyptian religion, restoring and building temples across the land, including the great sanctuaries at Edfu, Dendera, and Philae. They were often portrayed in temple reliefs, making offerings to Egyptian gods, reinforcing their legitimacy in the eyes of the native population. However, their actual court and administration remained largely Greek, and this dual identity was both a strength and a source of tension. The Ptolemaic dynasty was marked by internal conflict, complex family relationships, and political instability. The royal family followed a policy of sibling marriage, a tradition borrowed from the pharaonic past but intensified under the Ptolemies. Brothers and sisters often married and co-ruled, and succession disputes were common. Assassinations, coups, and rival claims plagued the dynasty, especially in its later years. Despite this turmoil, the early and middle reigns of the dynasty were periods of relative prosperity. Egypt remained wealthy through agriculture, especially grain production, and trade with regions across the Mediterranean and Near East. Taxes funded temple projects and military campaigns, and the royal court patronized artists, poets, and scientists. But as the 2nd century BCE progressed, the dynasty grew weaker. Economic pressures, civil unrest, and competition for the throne destabilized the kingdom. Meanwhile, Rome, once a distant republic on the fringes of Egyptian affairs, had risen to become a dominant power in the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies increasingly relied on Roman military and diplomatic support to resolve internal disputes, drawing Egypt further into the orbit of Roman influence. By the time Cleopatra VII came to power in the 1st century BCE, Egypt was still rich but politically fragile. Cleopatra belonged to a long line of rulers who bore the same name, but she would distinguish herself in many ways. She was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, which most of her Greek-speaking predecessors had not bothered to learn, and politically astute. Cleopatra initially co-ruled with her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, and later with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Their joint rule quickly turned into a power struggle, prompting Cleopatra's temporary exile. It was during this time of conflict that Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey during the Roman Civil War. Cleopatra saw in Caesar an opportunity to regain her throne. According to later Roman accounts, she famously arranged to meet him in secret, smuggled into his quarters concealed in a rug or a linen sack. Whatever the true details of their encounter, Caesar was impressed. He supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne and helped her defeat Ptolemy XIII in a civil war that culminated in a battle on the Nile. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra regained power, now co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, and later with her son Ptolemy XV, also known as Caesarion, Little Caesar, whom she claimed was the child of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra's reign was marked by efforts to stabilize Egypt's economy, strengthen its institutions, and assert its independence. She oversaw coinage reforms, temple restoration, and infrastructure projects. Yet her political future remained deeply tied to Rome. After Caesar's assassination, she formed a famous alliance with Mark Antony, one of the leading figures of the Roman Republic. Their partnership was both personal and political. Cleopatra and Antony had several children together and shared a vision of a Hellenistic Eastern Empire ruled from Alexandria. Their relationship, however, alarmed many in Rome, especially Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir. The rivalry between Octavian and Antony escalated into open war. Cleopatra supported Antony militarily and politically, but their combined forces were defeated at the naval battle of Actium. As Octavian's armies approached Egypt, both Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. Antony by falling on his sword, Cleopatra, according to legend, by the bite of an asp, though the exact method remains uncertain. With the death of Cleopatra VII and the subsequent annexation of Egypt by Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, the long era of pharaonic independence came to a final end. In the year corresponding to the late 1st century BCE, Egypt was transformed from a proud and ancient kingdom into a Roman province. Though its last monarch had claimed lineage from Macedonian conquerors, the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty closed a chapter that stretched back over 3 millennia. Egypt's transition into the Roman world was both dramatic and gradual. Politically, it became a special administrative territory of the Roman Empire, governed directly by a prefect appointed by the emperor rather than a senator. This unique status reflected both the immense economic importance of Egypt and the political caution of Rome's first emperor. Egypt's grain was essential to feeding the ever-growing population of Rome, and Augustus ensured that no Roman senator could hold military command in the province, thereby guarding against possible rebellion. The new Roman province retained many of its existing structures. Temples continued to function, priests remained in office, and Egyptian religion was still practiced alongside Roman customs. The Romans understood the value of continuity and generally respected the religious traditions of their subjects, at least initially. Augustus himself made offerings to Egyptian gods and restored temples damaged during previous conflicts. Latin became the language of administration, but Greek remained widely spoken, especially in Alexandria and among the educated elite, while Egyptian continued in religious and local contexts. Alexandria remained the cultural and economic heart of the province. It was the second largest city in the Roman world after Rome itself and one of its most important ports. Merchants, philosophers, artists, and scholars from across the empire lived and worked there. The Great Library of Alexandria, though already past its prime and having suffered damage in earlier conflicts, still represented a symbol of intellectual prestige. The Mouseion, originally established under the Ptolemies, continued to attract thinkers and writers. Despite this apparent continuity, Roman rule brought important changes. The bureaucracy expanded and became more hierarchical. Taxation became more centralized, with Roman officials recording land and property in great registers. These tax burdens could be heavy, and evidence from papyri shows that rural populations, particularly in the Nile Valley, struggled under the weight of Roman economic demands. The Roman emperors maintained a strong presence in Egyptian religious life. They were portrayed as pharaohs in temple reliefs, made traditional offerings, and occasionally funded construction or renovation of sacred buildings. But over time, Egypt's native religious institutions began to decline. Temples became less active, priesthoods lost some of their influence, and traditional festivals were increasingly overshadowed by Roman cult practices. One of the most significant developments during this period was the spread of Christianity. Beginning in the 1st century of the Common Era, Christian communities began to form in major Egyptian cities, especially Alexandria. The new religion was initially seen as a sect within Judaism, but quickly attracted diverse followers. Alexandria, already a cosmopolitan and intellectually vibrant city, became a major center of Christian theology and debate. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity was growing rapidly. Early church fathers such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen lived and taught in the city, developing theological schools that influenced Christian doctrine for centuries. However, this period was also marked by persecution. The Roman authorities, particularly under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, viewed Christianity as a threat to imperial unity. Christians were arrested, executed, or forced to renounce their faith. Despite the violence, Christianity in Egypt endured and eventually flourished. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan, and shortly afterward, it became the dominant religion of the Roman world. Egypt, and especially Alexandria, played a major role in shaping early Christian thought. The Council of Nicaea, convened by Constantine, sought to unify Christian belief and practice, and Egyptian bishops were among its most influential participants. One of the most pivotal Egyptian figures in this period was Athanasius of Alexandria, a staunch defender of the doctrine of the Trinity against Arianism. which denied the divinity of Christ. Athanasius's theological writings and leadership helped solidify the Nicene Creed as central to Christian orthodoxy. The rise of Christianity also brought significant cultural and religious transformation. Pagan temples were gradually closed, traditional rituals were suppressed, and Christian churches were built throughout the land. Monasticism, a movement that began in the Egyptian desert with figures like Saint Anthony and Pachomius, introduced a new model of religious life based on asceticism, prayer, and communal living. These desert monks became spiritual heroes, and their writings influenced Christian monasticism across Europe and the Near East. Administratively, Egypt came under the control of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire after the division of the Roman world into Western and Eastern halves in the 4th century. The Byzantine emperors continued many Roman policies, including heavy taxation and centralized governance. Greek became even more dominant in public life, while the ancient Egyptian language, now written in the Coptic script, survived mainly in religious and rural settings. Religious tensions increasingly defined the later centuries of Byzantine rule. Theological disputes between different Christian sects, especially over the nature of Christ, led to deep divisions. The Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century declared that Christ had two natures, divine and human, but many Egyptian Christians, later known as Copts, rejected this and maintained that Christ had one unified nature. This theological disagreement created a lasting rift between the Coptic Church and the Imperial Byzantine Church. By the early 7th century of the Common Era, Egypt stood once again at the crossroads of history. After centuries under Roman and Byzantine rule, the province had become an increasingly fractured and vulnerable region. Heavy taxation, sectarian conflict, and widespread dissatisfaction with imperial authority had alienated large segments of the Egyptian population. While Byzantine emperors struggled to maintain control over their eastern provinces, a new force was rising in the Arabian Peninsula that would soon transform not only Egypt but the entire region. That force was Islam. Emerging from the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam quickly spread across Arabia in the early decades of the 7th century. After the Prophet's death, the Rashidun Caliphate, the first Islamic state, initiated a series of military expansions that would bring much of the Byzantine and Sassanid worlds under Muslim control. Egypt, with its strategic importance and fertile lands, was an early target in this wave of conquests. The Islamic conquest of Egypt began during the Caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab and was led by one of Islam's most distinguished generals, Amr ibn al-As. In the year that corresponds to the early 60s of the Common Era, Amr entered Egypt from the east, crossing the Sinai and defeating Byzantine forces at several key locations, including the crucial battle at Heliopolis. The Byzantine resistance, weakened by years of internal strife and exhausted from recent wars with Persia, collapsed rapidly. The turning point of the campaign came with the siege of Alexandria. As the capital of Byzantine Egypt and one of the most important cities in the eastern Mediterranean, Alexandria was a formidable stronghold. Yet after a prolonged siege, the city surrendered. The Muslim forces agreed to relatively lenient terms. The Byzantine troops would withdraw, the inhabitants could retain their property and religion, and the city would be incorporated into the Islamic realm. With the fall of Alexandria, Egypt passed permanently out of Byzantine hands. Under Islamic rule, Egypt experienced a new phase in its long and complex history. The Arab conquerors brought with them not only a new religion, but a new administrative and cultural order. Amr ibn al-As established a new capital at Fustat, near the ruins of ancient Memphis, rather than ruling from Alexandria. This inland location allowed for easier integration with the broader Islamic world and better access to trade and agricultural routes along the Nile. Fustat quickly developed into a bustling urban center featuring mosques, markets, and administrative buildings. The first mosque built in Egypt, Masjid Amr ibn al-As, became a symbol of the new era. Unlike previous foreign rulers who sought to dominate Egyptian religion, the early Muslim authorities allowed for a considerable degree of religious tolerance. Christians, who formed the majority of the population at the time, were permitted to practice their faith, maintain their churches, and govern their own communities, provided they paid a special tax known as the jizya. This policy of relative religious tolerance contrasted sharply with the recent persecution many Coptic Christians had endured under Byzantine rule. As a result, many Egyptians viewed the new Muslim rulers not as conquerors, but as liberators. The Coptic Church, now cut off from imperial interference, was able to assert its independence and restructure its leadership without Byzantine oversight. Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Coptic as the administrative language of the province, and over time, it became the dominant spoken language of Egypt. The adoption of Arabic did not happen overnight. It was a slow and uneven process that took centuries. Similarly, Islam spread gradually, with conversion increasing over generations rather than through force. By the end of the 7th century, a growing number of Egyptians had embraced the new faith, especially in urban centers and administrative classes. Economically, Egypt flourished under Islamic rule. The fertile Nile Valley remained the breadbasket of the region, and the revenues generated from Egyptian agriculture played a vital role in financing the expanding Islamic caliphate. Grain, textiles, papyrus, and other goods were exported to the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and beyond. The canal system and irrigation works were maintained, and Fustat became a center of trade linking Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. The transition to Islamic rule also brought changes in art, architecture, and cultural expression. While Islamic Egypt moved away from the monumental stone structures of the Pharaonic and Greco-Roman past, it developed new architectural styles using brick, stucco, and wood. Mosques with intricate geometric decoration, calligraphy, and courtyards became central features of Egyptian cities. Despite the shift in religious and cultural paradigms, the legacy of ancient Egypt continued to persist in subtle ways. The Arabic language absorbed Egyptian words, and local customs blended with Islamic practices. Ancient temples, though no longer active, remained visible in the landscape, and memories of Egypt's deep past survived in folklore and legend. Even the use of the Coptic calendar, based on ancient Egyptian solar cycles, continued among Christian communities. In later centuries, Egypt would come under the control of successive Islamic dynasties, including the Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks. Each brought new contributions, challenges, and developments, but the foundation laid during the initial conquest remained critical. Egypt became not just a province, but a cornerstone of the Islamic world, a center of learning, culture, and spirituality. It was during the Islamic period that ancient Egypt began to be viewed with both reverence and curiosity. Muslim scholars, particularly during the Abbasid era, showed a growing interest in Egypt's antiquities. Writers, poets, and travelers marveled at the pyramids, obelisks, and statues of the old gods. Though much of the symbolic meaning of these monuments had been forgotten, their physical presence inspired awe and speculation. Over time, Egypt's ancient history became woven into the Islamic world's understanding of its own past. Figures such as Pharaoh became part of Islamic religious texts, particularly the Quranic narratives of Moses and the Exodus. These stories linked Egypt's biblical and ancient past to the spiritual framework of Islam, giving new meaning to the monuments of earlier ages. Centuries later, during the European Renaissance and Enlightenment, travelers and scholars from Europe would arrive in Egypt, sparking a new era of archaeological exploration and rediscovery. But even before this revival of Egyptology, the people of Egypt, Muslim and Christian alike, had preserved, lived among, and carried forward the legacy of a civilization that had shaped the world. Thus, the Islamic conquest of Egypt did not erase its past. It marked a transition. Egypt's ancient identity was not destroyed but transformed, folded into a new cultural and religious synthesis that would continue to evolve for over 1,000 years. From pharaohs to caliphs, from hieroglyphs to Arabic script, Egypt remained a land of continuity and change, a living testament to the resilience of its people and the enduring richness of its history. This concludes the full chronological journey through the history of ancient Egypt, from its earliest human settlements along the Nile to its incorporation into the Islamic world. The legacy of this remarkable civilization continues to echo across time, preserved in monuments, languages, ideas, and memory.